Good evening, everyone. We continue on our study in the book of First Samuel, entering into chapter 19. As we covered chapter 18, you could see that Saul began to be more and more fearful of David. He senses that time is not in his side. He feels very threatened by David. And he even uses Michal, his daughter, as a bait so that he could force David to perhaps be killed by the Philistines. And so, out of all these that has been attempted, David became more and more successful, became the husband of Michal, the son-in-law of the king. And at the end of chapter 18, we saw that uh, David became more and more successful because he was able to conduct himself very wisely, very circumspectly, and that God was with him. And you could see that David was a man after God's heart, and whatever he did was in honor of God. Now, when we come to chapter 19, we begin to see that Saul has started to change and he is now bent on killing David. And so we begin in verse 1 and says, Saul spoke to uh, Jonathan or Jonathan, his son, and all his servants, and told them that they need to, uh, cause David to die. So put David to death literally means to cause David to die. Now, Saul is no longer, I guess, keeping his intent to himself. And so, Jonathan, as we have read in the beginning of chapter 18, Jonathan loves uh, David greatly, like his own nephesh, as though David was himself. And so Jonathan, Saul's son, is said to have great delight in David. The idea here is uh, take great pleasure in David. And this is the description of the relationship between Jonathan and David. Verse 2. So Jonathan told David this thing. The word told is about a concept of reporting. Whatever Jonathan heard from Saul, Jonathan repeated it to David. And then he told David, you know what? Saul, my father, is seeking to put you to death. And this is the correct explanation or translation. Seeking, or I guess you could say that demanding, desiring that David die. So now, therefore, please be on guard in the morning and stay in the secret place to hide yourself. This is an advice from Jonathan to go and guard himself in the and be guard himself in the morning. And the word guard is to keep himself, to protect himself, right? To protect himself in the morning, and then stay in a secret place. The idea here, a secret place, is how would you say it? This would be a hiding place. A hiding place. And hide yourself. The idea of hiding oneself is uh to I guess be in secret, right? Be in secret. That would be the idea of hide yourself. Then Jonathan now says, I will go out, I will stand beside my father in the field where you are. So I will go out and I will stand beside my father. The idea here is to stand to his hand. That's the literal rendition of beside. So basically, what you find is that you have Saul, and then you have Jonathan, who would be by his hand, talking to him, and they will be in the field. Well, beside the field, I suppose, beside the field. And somewhere there you find David. And I will speak with my father about you. If I find out anything, that I will tell you. Basically, to see what Saul is going to do, and then report to David. In verse 4, we read this. Then Jonathan spoke well. The idea of well, these are words. This is Tov, spoke good of David to Saul, his father, and said, and let's pay attention to the statements. Do not let the king sin against his servant David, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. The word very beneficial is very good. And the idea of to you means Saul has seen them. And so let's break this down. Do not let the king sin against his servant David. So we have Saul not to sin against David because David has not sinned against Saul. Right? This is the whole crux. Why does the king need to offend David, since David has not offended Saul? And if you look at what he has done, his deeds, right, has done. Now, in the Hebrew context, everything is measured by what is seen, what is felt, what is done, what is executed, and those things are judged. So don't let the king offend David. Do something against David, because David has done nothing against you. And so you cannot mistreat David. You should not judge David. You cannot punish David because he hasn't done anything wrong. I think that would be a good way of expressing it, that David has not done anything wrong. And so this is what it means, has not sinned against you. Then why are you doing it against him? Now look at what Jonathan expresses further. Verse 5, for he took his life in his hand. This is important. He literally took his life, is put his nefesh in his hand and struck the Philistine. The third part here is the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. So you could see here, he struck the Philistine and the Lord brought about great deliverance is the killing of Goliath. And he put his life in his hand to do this so that we all can see that God has brought about great salvation. This is salvation for Israel. all Israel, including Judah, did not have to submit to the Philistines by winning this battle. And you know that he could have died in the battle, so he put his nephesh in his hand. Now, Jonathan has told him, you also saw it and you were rejoicing. You were very pleased, right? You were exceedingly glad. Then why then will you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death without a cause? So why would you sin, do offense to innocent blood? Is very important because in the Torah, in the law of God, innocent blood cannot be shed. God will want an account for it. If he is innocent, what does innocent means? He is, this word innocent, he is free from any guilt. The law of God protects the innocent. He is free from guilt. He is free from condemnation. If that's the case, why do you want to seek his blood? That is what Jonathan was saying. There is no cause. So this word without a cause literally means for nothing. For no reason. Undeservedly. I think you could use this word. Undeservedly. What did he do? Well, David didn't do anything that deserves death. So that is why he is called innocent, right? He's called innocent because he is unblemished. There is no cause. He doesn't deserve to die. That is how Jonathan was putting it. And he is appealing, interceding on behalf of David in front of Saul. Now, why is this important? Always understand, even at this point in time, Saul is king over all Israel. As king, he is Elohim. He has the power to take a life. He has the power to kill David. But this appeal by Jonathan is to talk sense into Saul. There is no reason for you to do that. No reason at all. He has done everything that is right and you're happy with it. Why do you want to do that? And that is the intercession of Jonathan. As a result, Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. And then Saul vowed. Now, this word vow here means he swore. And look at how he swore. He says, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. As the Lord lives is the, I guess, the basis of the swearing. As God lives, he, David, shall not be put to death. This is the solemn oath. Now, in the Torah, anyone who makes a vow to God in this form, right? As the Lord lives, and this is a very formal and very serious oath to God, and it must be carried out. If it's not carried out, then you find that God will demand a retribution from the one who makes the vow. When we come to verse 7, Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told, this is reported to David, all these words. And after this was spoken, Jonathan brought David to Saul. So it's David to Saul. And he was in his presence as formerly. Now, this word here, and he, David, was in his presence, Saul, as formerly, as yesterday, and the day before yesterday. This is the Hebrew words that is translated formerly. So basically, David was able to come back to the presence of Saul, and the presence of Saul literally means to the face of Saul, just like yesterday and the day before yesterday. And it seems from verse 7 that everything has come back to normalcy or some form of normalcy as in the days past. And because you remember, he made this solemn oath. Verse 8, when there was a war again, David went out and fought with the Philistines and defeated them with great slaughter, great blow, and they fled from his face. So again, you see that David is successful. And as we begin to see more and more, our chapters with regards to David seems to promote David into a more prominent position and thereby threaten the security of Saul. Now, verse 19. Now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul as he was sitting in his house with a spear in his hand, just like before in chapter 18. And David was strumming with his hand. This word here is strumming, meaning playing strings. And so the translator had given us the translation, the harp here. Yeah, it would be correct that David was strumming with his hand, making music with his hands, right? Strumming. But what I wanted to point out to you is this: an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul, or to Saul, or towards Saul. Now, this expression here is a very interesting expression. Every time you see an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul, you can literally imagine when you look at Saul, Saul became mad. And so he had this, I would say, maybe his schizophrenic, right? He may be schizophrenic, that something that doesn't, it's not normal, has overcome Saul. And it is said as, or described as, a spirit, a disposition, a disposition that is not functional. And not functional in Saul's mind as well, because it's overcome him and he's behaving like a madman. And this time round, while he was in the house, his spear was in his hand. Now, in chapter 18, he thought he was going to throw the spear and pierce through David and strike the wall. Now, is this going to happen in verse 10? Yes. So when you look at verse 10, you begin to see that Saul now actually attempts this. In verse 10, it says Saul tried to pin David to the wall with the spear. The text is saying is Saul sought to strike the spear into David and into the wall. That was the whole picture. You've got the wall and you've got David. And what Saul wanted to do was to cast the spear and stick it in the wall. Both David and the spear. That's what this phrase is trying to say. But David slipped away. The idea of slip away is this word here is escape. I think we translate this word as escape. But literally, you would see this word being, how should we say, slip away is burst away. I guess you would say this. Burst away. So what did David do? David quickly zoomed out. So we've got Saul threw the spear, but before it hit David, David zoomed away out of Saul's presence, out of the face of Saul. And as David tried to burst away, the spear he had, he struck it into the wall. So the spear went into the wall, but not with David. What David did was David escaped. This word fled is the word take flight. And then the second word here is escape. Escape means to slip away. Now, in this particular instance in verse 10, Saul wasn't talking to himself anymore. He was in a frame of mind where we could say that he has turned mad. He has been overcome with a disposition that is not functional. Maybe he was schizophrenic. And he took the spear and he threw it at David and it struck the wall. And David this time round wasn't turning away from Saul. He ran away. So this is an A and a B. He took flight and he slipped away that very night. Saul seems to know where he went. And so Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him. Now, these words are important. Remember, send means you have people who are being sent to represent Saul. In the ancient times, like messenger is malak, right? It's malak. Otherwise, it could be translated as angels. But in this case, they are messengers. They represent Saul, walk on behalf of Saul. And for all intents and purposes, carries the authority of Saul because they were sent by Saul. And they went to David's house to watch him, to observe him, to guard him. And what was the purpose? There was a purpose when the messengers were sent so that they can put him to death in the morning, basically to kill him. So the messengers are acting on behalf of Saul to go and kill David. Now understand this, that Saul made a vow. He swore in the name of God that as long as God lives, that David will not be killed. And then what happened? Well, something overcame Saul. He forgot everything he had said, and he sent messengers. And remember, messengers represent Saul right here, and walks on behalf of Saul to do what Saul would do, is to go and kill David. But Michal, David's wife, told David, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will die. That is what it means. So go ahead and escape. So the word save your life uh, means escape your nefesh. Take your nefesh and run away. That's basically what happens. And so Michal let David down through a window. Very popular way of escaping, just like Rahab, right? Rahab helped the spies of the Israelites do that. So it's always slipped down through a window, an opening of the house, and David went out and fled and escaped. You would see that these are three, well, you could say that um, three specific words that represent the same concept. He went out, he walked, he fled. The word fled here is to run away. And the third word here is that he escaped. And the word escape means to, well, let's see. Escape would mean to slip away. And so you would find that you have an A, you have a B, and you have a C. Three statements or three ideas that talks about the same thing. He went through a window and escaped. He ran away. That's what escape actually means, right? Is what it means, escape. Now in verse 13, this is a very vivid imagery of actions that's taking place. Michal took the household idol. This is called the teraphim. This could be a big statue. So the teraphim in this case is a big statue, or what you call an image. And what did Michal do is to take that image, laid it on the bed, and put a quilt of goat's hair at its head. This is made of goat's hair, and I think you can say that uh, this is hair that looks like David's hair. And so this is a pretense wig, right? Pretend to be David's hair and covered it with David's clothes. So that verse 13 is very much Michal trying to pretend that David is sleeping using the household statue, the big statue, an image, an idol to be in place in the bed. So when Saul sent messengers to take David, now understand this, the word take is to seize, to arrest, to take hold of David. Remember who are messengers and they are sent? Saul wasn't there, but it was the messengers that Saul sent, right, to see David. She said that he is ill, he is sick. Then Saul sent the messengers to see David. Now, obviously, you find that this is not a message that goes back and forth between the messengers and Saul. But it appears that the messengers are now acting on behalf of Saul and says, bring him up to me on his bed that I may put him to death. And so Saul really wants to kill David through the messengers, to see David and capture him and bring him back to Saul. Verse 16, when the messengers entered into the house, behold, the teraphim was on the bed with a quilt of goat's hair at its head. So you find that the teraphim had the shape with some hair, all right? And you had thought that that would be David sleeping under the covers, I would say, right? Sleeping under the covers, and that would be his hair. And the moment it was uncovered, they couldn't find David. All they found was that idol, that big statue that was on the bed. And so Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this and let my enemy go so that he has escaped? Why have you deceived me? The idea here is, why did you trick me? I think this would be a way to say this. Why did you trick me? Why did you mislead me like this so that my enemy, now this is important. Now Saul treats David as my enemy, is an enemy now, so that he has escaped, he has fled away. This idea here is that he has slipped away. Now listen to what Michal says. Michal said to Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I put you to death? Now, if you're careful, we would be able to say that this is the excuse that Michal said to Saul, that David had put a knife at her throat and threatened to kill her unless she lets him go. Now, this is what this whole statement would mean, that there is no need for me to kill you, and that's a threat. And so Michal said, it's David. He threatened to kill me, so I had to let him go. Now, verse 18, David fled, escaped, and came to Samuel at Ramah. No, remember, back in chapter 4 onwards, you find that Samuel was a judge in Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went to stay in this place. This place is Naoth, or yeah, Nayoth. And that is also somewhere in Ramah, right in that vicinity, right? In that vicinity. In verse 19, it was told and it was reported to Saul. There's a lot of reporting going back and forth. What you hear and what you say, it's not just merely tell, but to report back to Saul, saying, look, David is at Nayoth in Ramah. So verse 20, again, understand that Saul sent messengers to arrest, to seize David. But when they saw the company of prophets prophesying, so what we see is at this point in time, you see that there's a gathering of prophets and they were prophesying with Samuel standing and presiding over them. And this whole idea here is that you've got all the prophets, and then we have Samuel, and these prophets are what they say, speaking like a prophet. Now, speaking like a prophet means that they are speaking very unlike their normal self. And it says that uh, the wind of God, this is the wind of God, is not a big S, but the wind of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also spoke like them. And so what they found was that as these other messengers came by, this entire disposition was mapped onto Saul's messenger. Now, it appears that this effect was very intense and it can affect those people who came by. And so the messengers of Saul was taken on a disposition to speak like a prophet of God. And so they were able to speak. And so what we can see is this, that the utterances, if they are genuine, actually comes from God, that they hear what God says and they are able to recite it or repeat it. And in a way, they are actually being the mouthpiece of God. That's what it means. Verse 21, when it was told of Saul, he sent another batch of messengers and they also prophesied. And so Saul sent messengers again, and the third time they also prophesied. So we have 1, 2, and 3. All three behaved alike. Now, the idea of prophesying means that when you see them, they are speaking. They are speaking. Now, what they are saying, we're not told, but they seem to be speaking things which are acknowledged as what prophets would teach. And so they are supposedly, right, if you want to say, under the influence, or they are demonstrating the disposition. Now, this is not God zapping their minds, but it appears that seems to be some supernatural uh, effect right now, which the text doesn't quite exactly demonstrate and reveal, but it seems that there is an effect that affected the messengers of Saul, three groups of them, just like the ones that is speaking and to talk words that is under the influence of a divine being, that he seems to be able to speak things which normally he wouldn't say things that way. Verse 22, then he himself, this would be Saul, he himself went to Ramah and came as far as a large well in Seku. And he asked and said, where are Samuel and David? And someone said, behold, they are at Nayoth in Ramah. Then he proceeded there to Nayoth in Ramah. And now we read this again. And all those who came to Ramah was able to have their disposition turned around. The Spirit of God, or the wind of God, came upon him also, so that he went along prophesying continually until he arrived in Nayoth. And so this idea is a disposition of speaking. We will call it abnormally. And this is from the viewpoint of the audience. The audience is looking at Saul and saying that something has overcome him, and now he is acting strangely, but not violently. Now, this is the difference. This is a difference between the spirit or wind. And we read of two sorts or two dispositions. One is evil and one is good. The one that's evil is demonstrated by Saul becoming a madman. And in this case, it is good. It is seen as the wind of God, and he is speaking, although abnormally, things that are good. And so that is the view. We're not here to reinterpret what we're seeing. We are trying to just explain what we are seeing. And the text is actually written from the viewpoint of an external third-party observer. In our last verse, Saul, this is Saul, had stripped off his clothes. Now, this idea of strip off is to, I guess you can say, take off. Take off. So took off his royal clothes. Now, this would be a royal clothes. And he too spoke before Samuel, like the other prophets. He spoke good things. And then you can see this. This word lay down literally means he fell. Okay? He fell prostrate. So that this would be Saul on the ground, right? This is prostrate. He was on the ground, and the text said that he was naked. Now, was it that he had no clothes and he was bare? There were two particular views of this, right? There were particular views of this. One view says that when he took off his royal clothes, and that would be his clothes, right? His clothes is the royal clothes. Then he was naked with his undergarments, because he took out his clothes. So to speak, based on the some of the Jewish writings, that it appears that the moment he took off his royal clothes, he's considered naked in that sense. And he was like that all day and all night. He didn't put back his royal robes. Therefore, they asked, this is asked, right? Is Saul even, right? Even a prophet? Is Saul counted in the group of prophets? Because he was speaking good things that came out of his mouth, as opposed to when an evil wind appeared on him and that he became a madman, forgetting himself. And so in this case, you find that there are various characters of Saul being displayed here. And in this case, he was now beside himself. He was disrobed. So you can say that this is disrobed of his royal clothes. And so whatever he wore underneath is considered naked. And he was like that without putting on his clothes or his royal robes through the day and night. And he continued to speak what he heard of God. And so this is a visual narrative of how Saul was viewed at this point in time in chapter 19. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.